The study session to order. It's Groundhog Day. Roll call, please.
The record will reflect that that Council Members Rosansky, Mayor Selich, and aren't present.
Thank you. The first item of business is clarification for any items on the consent calendar. Councilmember Daigle.
Yes, on item 10, it's for the supplemental for the City Hall environmental, and I turned on the TV and they were talking about having a dog park, and it was the first that I had heard of it, and I just want to make sure that that environmental may or may not include a dog park.
That would certainly be for the City Council to decide. And Steve, I would imagine that that is going to be a part of the concept that might be presented tonight.
Yes, the dog park is included in the concept, and as Homer mentioned, it is up to the City Council what is included. But the idea of having the EIR is to kind of keep in all the options so we're covered environmentally.
Okay, because it kind of seemed like there was some outreach already underway on it.
The scoping meeting is next week.
Well, I think she's talking about dealing with the public, telling the public that
Yeah,
there
we're
may
having
be
a
a
dog
dog park. So I agree that we're in advance, that is a decision the City Council needs to make, and that we shouldn't do any outreach until that decision is made.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Gardner.
Yes, on item number 5, I noticed we've completed Phase 1. Now, does that mean that we are going to start seeing the 10% difference or whatever it is in Corona Del Mar, or not yet?
You mean you haven't seen it yet?
Well, I don't drive through Corona Del Mar. I'm usually walking, so it's hard for me to tell.
Well, Councilmember Gardner, we're still in the process of refining the system. The system is up and running, and our folks are getting trained, and we expect to see some improvements. We have already experienced a situation where we can actually see those signals in Corona Del Mar and see when there's problems. And another beauty of the system is it detects when loops are bad, so we've already experienced that. So in that respect, we have seen some improvements, but
Excellent.
I think you're going to see more as time goes on.
All right, thank you.
Councilmember Webb.
I think I'm going to pull item S24 for discussion, but I don't have a question right now.
Okay. Councilmember Henn.
Nothing.
And I have nothing. The next item on the agenda is the update on Lower Bay dredging issues. Mr. City Manager.
Yes, Chris Miller is going to walk us through this issue, and I thought the timing was such with the questions regarding the Upper Bay and Lower Bay and the President's economic stimulus package that we've had a couple of items on the agenda recently about the CAD, and that it would be a good time to bring Council up to speed on where we are with our sediment testing and also looking at the CAD site. Chris?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Curry and members of the City Council. My name is Chris Miller, manager of the Harbor Resources Department. And this afternoon I'm going to talk about where we're at with our Lower Bay dredging project and how it relates to our testing efforts that are underway and how we will deal with our contaminated sediments. And then we'll be finishing up with what our request is for this evening at the council meeting, and the next steps after that. So I would like to first overview what most people already know, but just want to point out a few of the obvious things and how the Upper Bay relates to the Lower Bay. The Upper Bay has we're in a 154 square mile watershed, which includes the cities of Irvine, Lake Forest, Laguna Hills, Tustin, Orange, Costa Mesa, Santa Ana, and Newport Beach. And as you can see by the drawing or the illustration here, that all the sediment comes down and flows down into the Lower Bay. What we're doing now with our Upper Bay project primarily is it's an ecosystem restoration project, but a component of that is to build these 2 catch basins referred to as Unit 1/3, and this is Unit 2. This right here is a Jamboree Bridge for a frame of reference. And what those catch basins are designed to do is catch the sediment that comes down from our watershed. And hopefully catch enough so that that sediment will not make its way down into the Lower Bay. It has. over the years that we've been a city, and so that's why I'm here to talk to you about lower bay dredging. And with these holes and catch basins that are here, we're hoping that that will give us about 20 years of life before we have to think about dredging the upper bay again. Where we're at with phase 1 of the Upper Bay project is that it's due to finish in May, and then phase 2 will go out to bid in probably June or July, assuming stimulus funding occurs or other funding mechanisms occur with the federal government. We feel good that stimulus funding will occur for the Upper Bay project because it is shovel-ready, and it's already been designed for the most part, and it's ready to go. So we feel confident that we'll be funded for that. This is just a picture of what's happening at the Jamboree Bridge of our dredge equipment that is currently there right now. Now we see by the illustration that the material makes its way and has made its way down into the lower bay. And our preliminary estimates right now are that we need about 1 million cubic yards to be dredged from the lower bay, which is in both the federal channels and the federal areas of responsibility, which would be, when I say federal areas of responsibility, I basically mean from project line to project line to project line, and all of these channels for the most part. So there's 2 different components with our Lower Bay project. One component is funding, and certainly and these are both very big components, and we're dealing with them on separate fronts. Federal funds and stimulus funds are not immediately available. We were hoping that they would come sooner than later and that the Lower Bay project would qualify, but we're finding that some of the other national projects that are occurring in our nation are more shovel-ready, and so now it's kind of a waiting game to see how the city of Newport Beach and the Lower Bay fits into the Corps of Engineers model in terms of funding this sort of effort. But if that doesn't work, we can always rely, hopefully, on the regular federal budget for next year and beyond. The Corps of Engineers is committed to helping out the city of Newport Beach. We've had meetings with the Corps, including the Colonel and several members of the City Council, to talk about how the Corps and the city can work together to fulfill a common goal of dredging lower Newport Bay. And the Corps has indicated that they're very supportive of the city's efforts, and they will do everything that they can to help us out if the city solves our contaminant issues and if there is adequate funding. So assuming those 2 things come into play, the Corps is expressed a great interest in coming and to help us. And so we have a good relationship with them, and we're looking forward to working with them in the near future. Now, also on the funding topic, the city wants to jumpstart this effort. As I said previously, that the Corps would like for us to solve our sediment, our contaminant issues. And if we figure out that problem, then the Corps is more likely to come in and dredge the lower bay. So what the city has done, and this is just to give a little bit of recap on some city council actions, the city council has hired a consultant to develop a sampling and analysis plan, which I'm going to go into a little bit here in the next couple slides. And then they've also hired a different consultant to look at how we can deal with our contaminated sediments. The point is that the city is taking it upon ourselves to kickstart this project and make it more palatable so that the Corps of Engineers can come in and do what they do best, which is dredging and taking care of the 1 million or so cubic yards that we have in our harbor.
Question for you, because sometimes when we talk about the amphipods,
Yes.
my eyes start to glaze over. So I kind of wanted to ask you first about the CAD, because it seems to me that what we need to do is to dig this big hole, and then there's some question as to the quantities that we're going to put in the hole. And so the quantities that we put on in the hole depend on the amount of sediment that is determined to be contaminated and not suitable for LA3 or beach nourishment. Secondly, it's sediment that could include that of tenants around the harbor, such as American Legion in those areas that can't currently go to LA3. So we may be able to help out local tenants of the harbor. And then another aspect that will help determine the quantities is whether we're going to dredge to design depth or to authorized depth.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of wanted to get some sense of what the range of volumes are that are sort of in play to put into a CAD.
Okay.
And then within the testing, within the sort of contaminated category and clean category, what the city is doing to determine that line, and at what sort of extent or how much effort do we want to go to fine-tune that line, or at what point do we just want to say, you know what, we've done a lot of testing, and when you get into Tier 4 testing, it gets very creative, there's no standards, and we start thinking eelgrass and that kind of stuff. So those are some of my questions, I guess, as you move along that I sort of want to try to understand.
Okay, and I'll do my best to explain those as the presentation proceeds. And stop me if I need elaboration. So let's see, I'll go back to this slide and remind there are two components of dredging. One is funding. So I just talked about that. But the second component is testing. And one of the things that you have to do when you dredge a harbor is you have to develop a sampling and analysis plan, which is a plan that the agencies all have to review and take a look at and approve before you can actually do the chemistry and toxicity tests that are required for any type of dredging program. So one is to develop a SAP, but also is to develop a confined aquatic disposal site for contaminants. Now, the city has not yet committed to a CAD site yet, but we are going down that path, and I'm going to explain a little bit later on what is leading us to believe that a CAD site is basically the best option for the city of Newport Beach. Both of these components, funding and testing, are very complex tasks which require coordination, planning, outreach, and time. Coordination certainly among all the agencies. There are so many agencies, 7, 8, 9, 10 different agencies that you have to coordinate with when you're doing a dredging project. When you consider all the fisheries organizations, the Corps, a couple branches within them, the EPA, Coastal Commission, and all these folks that have to be on the same page when you're developing a plan. Of course, planning. Outreach is very important. Getting out to the community. Both myself and Councilmember Daigle are starting to make presentations throughout the community and let people aware of what's going on so that we're all on the same page. Time is a very these types of projects, they don't happen overnight. They do take a long time, and there are bumps along the way. So it just comes with the territory when you have a major project like this. So now the question is, where are most of the contaminants? And shaded in this yellow area right here is where we believe to be most of the problem areas that are occurring in our lower bay. Now we have a potential of, and I have to emphasize the word potential, of 700,000 cubic meters of contaminated material in the lower bay. And that does not include the Rhine Channel. This blue area right here is considered, or is, the Rhine Channel. We already know that in the Rhine Channel we have about 100,000 cubic yards to dispose of. That's a given. We've already done the research on that. But where we're unsure of are these primary areas right here, and we're narrowing down our quantities. This 700,000 is a very big number. I know that, and everyone else agrees to that. It's incumbent upon our consultant who is working with us right now, and I'll get into the next slide, who's doing the testing, to try and narrow that number down to create so that we don't have to dispose of 700,000 yards. And ideally, in my mind, it'd be nice if we were somewhere in the 200,000 cubic meter range. I don't know if that's going to be true or not. We're going to know a lot more in the next few months. But this is a large number, and it's something for us to work with right now so that we can plan big and then narrow down as we learn more information.
Are we continuing to test the Rhine Channel?
No, we stopped that. Well, we finished that project in 2005, and so we are on board with that project. We know what's down there. The city, that is going to be a separate project that the city and the state will have to commit to, and that's something else that I'm working on as well. Not specifically right now, but we are planning for the Rhine Channel cleanup. Our mission is to get that done from our board, from the state board order. We have about 8 years to go. So that's in our very near time frame when we have to do something about the Rhine Channel.
Chris, can I ask you a question on this side? You say potentially 700,000 cubic meters of contaminated material. You said earlier 1 million, basically, cubic
Right.
meters. So are you saying about what we think now, about 300,000 are not contaminated, that would just need to be dredged and go out to LA3?
That's what we suspect, yes.
Okay.
There are some areas of the harbor where we do not expect the contaminants to hold us down with our sampling and analysis plan, which we have submitted. So, and again, our goal is to narrow down that 700,000 because the smaller amount we have to deal with, the less expensive it is.
Now, within that consultant's proposal, they had broken down the harbor into 9 zones. I think it was like A through J. And a lot of those zones are, by Linda Isle, Balboa Yacht Club, those areas. What's the status of clearance in those areas with EPA?
Okay. And that consultant that we are working with is called Newfields. That's their name, and they're doing all the testing in the harbor. A lot of things have happened since that contract was let back in September, October, and the project was broken down into segments. Let's just say there were 10 segments. There was a segment A, B, C, D, E, and F. Those segments, we have to change our focus now with this project in terms of looking at the project from a segmented point of view to an overall global project point of view. One of the reasons is because part of our discussions with some of the regulatory agencies months past led us to believe that certain past data that we could use, certain past data that we had, we could use and apply towards this current project. Well, we're finding that that's not altogether true now anymore. And so the agencies are making us go through a little bit more rigorous testing program and protocol, and that's why we're coordinating with our sampling and analysis plan that we turned in yesterday. Our sampling efforts now have been expanded, and areas where we didn't think they would require very much testing now have to be tested and have to go through bioaccumulation and chemistry and toxicity tests. And so right now we're trying to negotiate with the agencies to minimize the degree of those testing. And I guess the answer to your question, Councilmember Daigle, is that the project now has to be looked on as an overall kind of a global project instead of a piecemeal sectional project like we thought it was going to be last fall. And again, the reason is because our testing criteria has changed. What we were told and led down a certain path, well, that path has now changed so that now we're ordered to do this. But what I would want to stress, though, with that change, though, is that our time frame hasn't changed too much. And in fact, I'm going to go into the next couple slides, but we are going to have most of our questions answered by, I'll say, midsummer. And then of the more difficult questions, we're going to have those answered by early fall. So the timing is going to work out in that we'll have a lot of our questions answered, most of them, in fact, by early fall, before any work is even permitted or even can begin to be constructed.
No, are we documenting that relationship with EPA? I don't know EPA, but for some of us in the Bay Issues Committee, we felt with the eelgrass, it was always kind of a moving target, and there were problems with that. And so it always worries me when I hear of federal agencies kind of going in a different direction. So I just want to make sure that we're documenting it, so if we have to go through other channels, we would be able to do that.
I have that documentation.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Okay, so I've kind of touched upon this already. The goal, of course, is to try and maximize the material that goes out to our offshore disposal site in the ocean, and the site is called LA3. Our bathymetry study is complete, and what that does is that compares depths of the bay from 2005 to 2008. That was important because that leads us to determine how much quantities that we have to dredge. It compares depths.
Chris, in layman's terms, can you just sort of share with us the difference in the depth of the lower bay between those two studies?
There's not a whole lot of difference, believe it or not, between the material that the depths in 2005. We haven't had a lot of sedimentation in those 3 years. So really we're and when we were getting back to our testing contract, we were hoping that a lot of that data from 2005 would still be, all of our testing data that we had in 2005 would still be valid because there hasn't been a lot of increase in sedimentation. But we're finding that not to be true now. This is, I don't want to get too much into detail, but you have amphipods, which are test critters, which are used as benchmark test critters. And if those amphipods survive, well, then that means you have sediment that is suitable for ocean disposal. If they don't survive, then you have to figure out where to put that sediment, among other tests, of course. But believe it or not, picking out a suitable species to use of these amphipods is a complex process. And we found that some of our amphipod different species failed. And so we spent about a month or two trying to figure out and going through a whole nother retest so that we could get a suitable species that would work for Newport Bay.
Well, given that there's over 7,000 kinds of amphipods, how do you find a suitable species?
Well, in the Green Book, they have certain species that are preferred. And so they have like a suite of species, I'll say. And some agencies, when they review the plans, they prefer some over here or some over here for for certain applications. We are trying very hard, and we succeeded in using this species called Ampeliska, which is more suitable for Newport Harbor, and we were able to test and to prove that species would work best in our favor. And this is something that's interesting that wasn't in existence back last fall, but there's such thing now as the Dredge Material Management Team, which is a group of all the agencies that get together, and it's kind of like a TAC team, where the agencies meet once a month, and they talk about all the sampling and analysis plans from all up and down the coast. And so it's a way for review with all the agencies, and this team called the Dredge Material Management Team did not exist last fall. It's newly formed in January. And so when you get everybody together, it does tend to hold up the process. They only meet once a month. So you kind of have to go on their schedule, and then they bring in a few more variables into the equation, and so we're keeping up with that. We are meeting with them in April's DMMT. We are meeting with them at the end of the month, and those are their roles. Those are the types of things they discuss up there. Again, I want to stress that dredging the lower bay is not something where you can just go in and take a clamshell and start dredging. There's a tremendous amount of planning and coordination among agencies, among the public, and among everybody else involved to make this complicated process happen. So-
Question for you. Now, when the core LA region came to our Bay Issues Committee, they expressed an interest to participate in joint planning with us, and certainly the assistance of the Corps to help out with the higher levels of the federal government would be great, and they can kind of carry the jug of water to these various agencies. Where are we as far as getting together on the joint planning?
Well, I think I can answer that by saying that the dredge material management team is certainly the first step. We met with the colonel, it's been about 4 weeks now, maybe 5, and about 2 weeks ago we had a large conference call with a few of the agencies involved, the Corps and the EPA, and then this dredge material management team, which is meeting at the end of April. That's going to be where everybody gets together and evaluates our plan. So we are coordinating with them. We have the member of the Army Corps of Engineers present this evening, as well as members of Anchor QEA, which are going to help me out with the presentation on the next slide here. So the question that we have now is, what are we going to do with the contaminants? Well, the city has hired a company called Anchor QEA to develop what's called I call it a feasibility study, and they just finished that this afternoon, in fact. And the copies are on your desks there, and I see you've read through them or glancing through them. But what this does, what this plan does, is this tells us if it's feasible to do a CAD site. Now, I'm going to tell you what a CAD site is in a few moments, but is it feasible to do that? And what are some of our options, and how do we explore them? And so that leads me to introduce Steve Capolino with Anchor QEA. And what he's going to do is come up here and discuss the various options that were considered. Option number 1 being on-site sediment treatment, where you take all the sediment, you treat it on-site somewhere, on a beach somewhere. Future port fill, upland landfill disposal, Long Beach confined aquatic disposal, and lower Newport Bay CAD. And so yes.
Chris, one question for you before they come up, and I know they're no stranger to the harbor. They did our Rhine Channel testing. They also do work for Irvine Company in Lido Anchorage. My question, though, is on the issue of dredging to design depth or authorized depth. Where are we on that issue?
Okay. Well, right now we are...
What the difference between the two are.
Okay. There is a difference between authorized depth and design depth. Design depth is what the harbor was originally designed to be dredged to back in 1936. Authorized depth is what the locals at the time dredged our harbor to in about 1941 or so. And we have a map. The Corps of Engineers supplied us with a map that shows us what that authorized depth is. And we are planning to bring that down to the depth that the harbor once was in 1941, the authorized depth. It's still deep. It's going to get us a lot. It's going to get us 1 million cubic yards. To get down to the design depth would significantly increase our project, increase the cost, and it would also make it new dredging as opposed to maintenance dredging. And there's a difference there in the agency's eyes as to how that is permitted. So right now we're focusing on bringing the project to authorized depth.
So what's the footage difference generally between authorized and design?
Well, in some cases it could be authorized depth might be minus 10 feet, mean low water. Design depth might be minus 12. Could be minus 15 in some areas, but there's not too big of a difference there. Our harbor right now is certainly below minus 10 in many areas, so we're going to be taking out a lot of material and really bringing it back to where it was 60, 70 years ago. So with that, I'd like to introduce Steve Capolino. If you'd please come up here, Steve.
Council members. Excuse me, as Chris mentioned, You have a document there in front of you that we just put together, and what we really tried to do with this document was, Chris said, tried to lay out a feasibility study. There's been a lot of talk about building a CAD site, and I'll talk about that in a second, what that is, and what are some of the pros and cons with that. But one of the things that we wanted to do with this document was to try to lay out what are all the options that are out there right now in Southern California, and to try to lay out what are some of the pros and cons. Try to describe to you, if you did select one of these other options, what would that look like to try to implement in Newport, and try to lay out a little bit of a path of why we've sort of come before Chris and said, you know, we think that a CAD site would be something that you should consider. So I'm just going to quickly run through these. Please interrupt me if I don't provide enough detail on any one of them. But really, when you're dealing with contaminated sediments in Southern California, you're pretty limited to what options you have. I mean, one of the first things you could do is you could look at treating the material. When we say treating the material, you're trying to do something that can either immobilize the contaminants in the sediment such that they don't cause biological effects either to people consuming, you know, playing in the water, eating fish that live in the bay, or actual effects to the animals living in the bay. So you can either stabilize them to try to make the chemicals so that they become inert, essentially, or you do something that you strip out the contaminants, and you're essentially what you're doing is you're still leaving the material either behind in the bay in an inert state, or you're removing it, taking the contaminants out, and then trying to beneficially reuse that material. Two of the most popular approaches that people are using right now or looking at in this area is one of them is called cement-based stabilization, and the other one's called sand separation. They're two very different approaches. Cement stabilization is the one I mentioned previously, where you basically take your mud and you mix it with Portland cement, lime, kiln dust, various type cement-based additives. And what essentially you'll do is it'll create a material that you could compact and use it as like a road-based material or some type of like product. It's a pretty expensive process to do. It's been used quite a bit more on the East Coast with really highly contaminated stuff. What people have found is there's sort of a cost-benefit ratio with it. To the cost and the effort that goes forward with doing it is something that typically is reserved for the really contaminated, nasty stuff, you know, and people don't typically select it as their first alternative. But it can be cost-effective if you set up a big enough facility to process it and do it. It's a pretty wide-ranging alternative. You can treat metals, organics like DDT and PCBs and stuff like that, so it's able to handle a broad base of chemicals. It is an agency-approved process. It has been done EPA. Corps of Engineers have actually funded on the East Coast pilot studies. There was one here that the Corps of Engineers, with other agency support, sponsored here in Long Beach area about 5 or 6 years ago. It has a secondary benefit of you actually dewater the material at the same time because the cement absorbs the water when it reacts. And it creates a product that you could take it and use it beneficially, assuming you have a place that could take upwards of 700,000 or 800,000 meters of material, which is quite a bit. And to kind of put that into perspective, I don't know, a double hauler waste truck that you see on the road, like a construction truck that has the big dump on the back with the tow behind one, those typically haul somewhere from 12 to 15 cubic meters. So when we talk 700,000 or 800,000 cubic meters, you can kind of do the math pretty quick in your head how many thousands of trucks that includes. One of the biggest cons with looking at something like a cement stabilization is a lack of recipients for the treated material. The problem that you have is if you go out and you try to broker a deal with some type of company that's doing like a road construction project or a neighborhood development project, is you've got to find somebody who's willing to take this material, reuse it, and basically have it come with a clean bill of health, something that's going to say, you know, I mean, if I'm a developer and I'm going to take this material, I'm going to want to know that those contaminants aren't going to ever come out of this material, that I'm not going to build houses on this and find out down the road that it's going to become a love canal type situation. And unfortunately, with most of the cement stabilization projects is there hasn't been enough of them done out there. You know, while it's an agency-approved process locally, the agencies here haven't really seen it happen very much. We've actually participated in projects where we've gone out and met with construction companies and tried to convince people to be willing to take the material, and they just haven't been too excited about it. Probably one of the biggest cons with it from an impact standpoint is that it requires you to have a treatment site. You have to have some way to process material. And basically what that would look like is you need like probably a 2 to 3 acre site right along the bay someplace where you could dig this stuff up, put it in a barge, pull it up to it, and pick all this material out of this barge and create these big giant cells that you mix the contaminants up with the cement. And then you have to have an area where you lay it out and let it dry. And then once it's dry, then you pick it up, put it in a dump truck, and then you haul it out. It's a pretty slow process at best, 1,000 cubic yards per day, so about 700 or 800 cubic meters per day. So you're looking at, you know, for this type of a project, what you guys are faced with, you could be talking about 2 years of work to process it. And the adjacent land impacts are pretty significant. You know, processing 1,000 yards per day means that you've got 1,000 yards per day leaving the site once you build up your stockpile. You know, so you've got dozens and dozens of trucks coming in and out of wherever that area is. The next option there, sand separation. This is a new one that has been tested recently. The Corps of Engineers actually just completed. We worked with them on a large pilot study at Marina del Rey. The concept there is that if you have an area that has really high sand content, like 90, 100% sand, so stuff looks kind of like beach material, but it has contamination in it. What we found is that a lot of the contaminants, like DDTs, will stick themselves to the clay particles that are in the sand. And if you could figure out a way to separate out the two, what you can do is actually produce clean sand and then concentrated contaminants as in the fine-grained material. And it's a very cost-effective process to do that. You use a mechanical process like a hydrocyclone, which is a big machine that you feed in a slurry. The mud and the sand goes to one side and the fine-grained slurry comes out the other side. Works really well. Like I said, the Corps just completed a large pilot study, probably about a $4 million pilot study at Marina del Rey to test this process. Problem that you have with an operation like this in Newport Harbor is, again, it requires a near-shore on-site treatment facility. You got to have a way to get all that sand material that you processed back off to the beach someplace and all the contaminated stuff up to a landfill.
How big of a site do you need for that?
2 to 3 acres.
2 to 3 acres?
Yeah. That's about the size of the site that we used for Marina del Rey, and it seemed to work well because you got to actually process all the wastewater that comes out of there, and it's quite a big operation. Probably the biggest problem that with Newport is that the sand content for a lot of the areas where you guys have contaminants is not very high. Where you guys have sand, most of it's pretty clean. Where you have a lot of your contaminated stuff, like down over in the West Lido area, up in the Rhine Channel and stuff, the sand content's actually pretty low, and it's low enough to the point to where it's really not very cost-effective to do this, meaning that you go through this entire process and you treat it, and you still have 50% of material that has to get dried up and taken to a landfill, and the portion that's able to go out to the beach is not very good. It's typically reserved for places where you have like 90, 95% sand. One of the more popular options that has been used in the region up until the last couple of years was to look at a port fill, and I say future port fill there. But basically, you know, Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, they're always creating new terminals. They're filling slips, they're building and expanding their terminals there. And the way they do that is essentially just dike off an area, pump or dig out all their contaminated stuff as well as clean material, and then push it in there, dry it out, put clean stuff on top, asphalt, and then turn it into upland. That used to be a good option in the region up until a couple of years ago when a lot of the environmental impact issues started to rise with like air quality and degradation to local neighborhoods and stuff. And what happened is you saw a lot of lawsuits come out up in LA Long Beach. And pretty much what happened a few years ago was a lot of these large development projects kind of ground to a halt. Unfortunately, the need for fill material or the supply of fill material that needed to go into there didn't stop growing. What happened is it's just backed up. The port, most of these fill sites gets filled up with port stuff. They obviously are getting preferential treatment to their own material that they have just through normal operations up there. And then secondarily, it would go to Corps of Engineers channels or local city governments up in the area, like the city of Long Beach, for example. Right now, port fill sites are very few and far between. There's a couple going on right now. They're overcommitted with the material that's going to go in them. So it's not a real good approach to bank on from an alternative to say this is where we're going to put all our eggs in this basket. One of the big things with port fill sites is they're usually, the fill site is actually usually one piece of a much larger puzzle when the ports create these. Typically what happens is like we're working with the Port of Long Beach right now on a very large fill site, and the project that we're working with them on that fill site is one of 6 projects that's going in there. And all of these projects have to be coordinated at the same time with when the fill site, when the tenants that are currently on the slip that need to get moved out, when new tenants are coming in. One lawsuit in any one of those 6 or 7 projects puts a delay into the entire thing, and it creates a domino effect. So like when I mentioned on the cons here, and again, you have all this stuff in your document, so I'm not necessarily trying to cover every bullet, but when I say does not provide a guaranteed solution for the city, what I mean there is it's not something you guys could sit back and say, okay, let's plan forward, then 2 years from now we're going to start a construction job and we're going to take it for Port of LA or Port of Long Beach. There's no guarantee that that fill site's going to be available, or when it is available, there's no guarantee that your project's going to be at the exact point where you're ready to start digging it up and taking it there. There's also a big issue with liability transfer agreements. We've been involved in a few with the ports up there, and typically if they're taking material in from somewhere outside of their own site boundaries, they have some pretty onerous transfer agreements that they're going to require for people to bring material there. Basically that says that if anything ever happens with that material, or if anything down the road impedes their ability to develop that site, they're going to come back and hold whoever the owner of that material is liable. Upland landfill disposal, it's really a pretty simple option. You dig it up, you got to dry the material so that there's no water dripping out of it so they can be hauled on the road. Put it in a truck, haul it to a landfill, and dump it. As Chris mentioned, we were involved with the Rhine Channel feasibility study for you guys 5 years ago now, 6 years ago. And we looked pretty hard at the landfill disposal option. We actually included meetings with the Orange County landfill authorities. And their official position was that they, A, didn't have the capacity to take the amount of material that would be generating, and B, they didn't really want the material because their landfills weren't necessarily permitted to be able to receive contaminated marine sediments. So their official position was they didn't want the material. The LA Regional Water Board, Southern California, it's really LA and Orange County, but the Regional Water Board's official position is they don't want contaminated marine sediments going into the county landfills. There have been a few small landfill disposal projects. I think like up at Bolsa Chica there was some small stuff that went out, but typically stuff flying under the radar, a few thousand yards here and there. But for a project of this size, if you want to take to a landfill, you're looking at a private treatment facility, so something like a waste management facility up in the desert north of LA. Typically, that's the city would enter into a contract with somebody like Waste Management. They would come in for somewhere $100, $125 a yard. They would take the material once it had been dredged and dewatered, put it on their truck, sign a piece of paper, and then you're removed of all liability, and they take it away and haul it to one of these facilities. And that's really your only option there. Very expensive. Agencies don't really support it, not from the sense that they don't think it's environmentally protective because these facilities are designed to hold this material. It's just that they don't want to see the capacity being used up for marine sediments. They'd rather see that material try to be used some other way. Long Beach CAD site, kind of just to jump the gun here a little bit about what a CAD site is. It's essentially kind of like an underwater landfill. Basically, you either take an existing hole that's in the ground that somebody else has already dug for some other reason, like the harvest sand material, or you create a hole, you put all the contaminated stuff down the bottom, and then you cover it up with clean material. So that what the animals and the fish and that's exposed on the surface layer is clean native sands. In Long Beach, if you've ever been out in the Inner Harbor, there's a whole bunch of oil islands. There's all these islands that got nice palm trees growing around them. Well, inside of those circle of palm trees are oil rigs, and they're basically drilling all over under Long Beach. The way they created those islands was they basically just dug these giant pits in the Inner Harbor, stacked the material up, and created an island. So as a result, all over the Inner Harbor of Long Beach, there's all these big pits. The Corps, the City of Long Beach, and a bunch of other agencies back in about 2001 did a pilot study to prove that CAD sites would work here. CAD sites are used all over the U.S., have been used in the U.S. for many years, been used in Europe for many years very successfully. So this...
Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Sorry.
Question for you, because you're saying that in Long Beach their CAD site's been inclusive, they've accepted all kinds of material. If Newport, if we were to do one in our harbor, what's the viability of being able to accept sediment from some of our residents and so on that are now unable to dispose of their materials? I mean, we have the RGP 54, so the city's made every effort to try and simplify the dredging process for our local residents, but we've been really stymied by the contaminant issue. So would that be viable at all to take that sediment too?
It's definitely viable, and that would be something that you'd be covered during the permitting process, that when you get the disposal site approved by the agencies, you would essentially tell them this is what the intent is for, and it's going to be for everything within Newport Harbor, whether it's city, core, or local, private dock owners that would want to take the material to that site and use it as a low-cost alternative. So for this part of this Contaminated Sediments Task Force, a multi-agency group here in the region, they did this pilot study. We actually worked with the Corps and helped them construct this job. It was a very decent-sized project. It was about 120,000 meters. And the purpose of this was to actually construct one here locally, just to prove to the local agencies that it could work. Constructed it, put the cap on top of it, and then the Corps of Engineers has been monitoring it for like the last 7 years, and it showed that everything's working perfectly. So technically, very easy to do. In that area, I have down in the con, not supported by LA County Environmental Advocates. There's a group up there called Heal the Bay. That's an environmental group. And they've historically not supported the project. Not from a technical standpoint, they just have a philosophical mission that they don't believe that any contaminated material should be disposed of anywhere within the water, that the material should be taken out of the water to a landfill, regardless of which one may have less impacts to it. So that project has the pilot study was done. No future projects have been constructed thus far. The city has not decided yet what to do with it, whether or not to turn it into a long-term disposal site for themselves or for others to use. So it's a big question mark on that one. The pit has plenty of capacity to it, but at this point, it's not really it's not been permitted for future use.
What would be this? I'm sorry. Go ahead. What would be the schedule for permitting in Long Beach as opposed to permitting for a de novo facility we would create in Newport Beach?
Permitting a facility in Long Beach obviously would be a much quicker and cheaper alternative because it's already there and it's already been tested. And more importantly, the site's already constructed and it's actually been used there. The real issue would be whether or not the city of Long Beach wants to permit it. The city has concerns that if they permit that as a facility, that there'll be pressure put upon them to accept material from other areas, whether Newport or Marina Del Rey or any place else. And there's some internal struggles going on there about whether or not they want to be perceived as taking other people's waste material, which is why what's happened, what we've seen happen in our experience, I mean, this type of work is primarily what our firm does, so we have a lot of experience with these. What we find out is that a lot of these end up becoming localized solutions. We're building one right now up in Port Hueneme Harbor for the Navy, the Corps, and the Oxnard Harbor District. It's this exact model that we're talking about here in Newport and what was used up in Long Beach. And that one was really the same situation. There, to be honest with you, there's available space in the Port Hueneme CAD site right now that's in construction today. The problem is that because of Navy owning the land there, they have some internal policies about waste coming in from outside of the harbor in there. So what it means is that anything that's within that harbor can go in that pit pretty easily. Nobody really has issues with it, but as soon as people start bringing it in from outside, it really starts to complicate it. So Lower Newport CAD site, what are some of the pros? It's obviously, we think we found that it's more cost effective than upland disposal. Upland disposal is quite expensive. You can accept all the material at once. There's not an issue to where, like, if you were going to go to a landfill that they say they can only take 1,000 meters a day, you can put as much as you can dig in the CAD site. Probably one of the bigger things is that the city controls the schedule and the process with it. It's a solution that allows the city to work at their pace, at their schedule, at their budget. It's not tied to having to be ready by a certain period to time it with somebody else's project and another reason. As I mentioned, Port Hueneme is a fresh example. It's going on right now. We're 1 week away from finishing all the contaminated sediment going into the hole, and then starting in about the next week and a half, we're going to start covering and capping that one. It's a fresh example, just went through the permitting, all the agencies, it's fresh in their minds, so it's a very good opportune time to move forward with that type of an option. The cell excavation, digging the hole, most likely is going to be able to provide nice, good beach quality material for replenishing the beaches. What are some of the cons? I'm not new to Newport Harbor. I've had a boat here for 7 years in the harbor, so I spent a lot of time. I know how temperamental some of the minor issues like bait barges and grow-out pens and stuff like that can create issues for the local community, and certainly putting in a big dredge and a crane working in somebody's backyard for 6 or 8 months is going to create issues. There's going to be aesthetic issues. You're going to have some disruptions to navigation. You can try to position it in the harbor such that you minimize those efforts. You could have temporary displacement of boaters if you have to move people around off their moorings.
No, I understand that because some of the council members saw a graphic where this was originally proposed right in the middle of a mooring field,
Right.
there's been some adjustment to that.
Right, yeah, the more recent area we're looking at is right in between, is that G and H? H and F, okay. Yeah, originally when we drew the first box in the preliminary maps that we sent over to Chris, we put it squarely on top of where the mooring field was because we thought that there would be less complaints if you moved people off their moorings than if you impacted like an open area where sailboat races occur. But as you guys mentioned, it sounds like it was easier. There was no technical reason why we had it in one spot or the other. So yeah, the current idea is to shift it over to eliminate that. And of course, there could be some environmental groups here, and there probably will be residents that would not be happy of, the concept of disposing contaminated sediments in the harbor, even though they would be buried. So what does a CAD cell look like? It's a very simple cartoon. Basically, you're just excavating out a pit, putting the contaminated material down at the bottom, covering it with clean material. This clean material would be like native sediments from the harbor that are clean. That would basically be what's out there right now. That plant growth and stuff would reestablish itself on the top. Technically, from a chemical standpoint, to prevent the chemicals from moving, most 3 feet is usually enough. The standard that most people go with is 5 feet. In Port Hueneme Harbor, we're using 10 feet. And the reason for that is our CAD cell there we're building is right in the middle of the active turning basin in the center of the harbor. So we build it as 10 feet so that if they wanted to deepen the harbor by another 5 feet at some point in the future, they could just excavate down and they wouldn't have to move any of the material. So probably the safest option would be to assume about 5 feet.
Question for you, Steve. We're going to continue to pursue some of the testing, but, we don't know if we're going to be able to conclude some of those areas. And based on your experience, I know Josh has worked in the regulatory department at the Corps. What happens in a few months where, we don't get clearance? What would be the city's options at that point? Can we just sort of throw in the towel and say, you know what, it's contaminated, not that much more expensive to just put it in a CAD? How do you see... What do you kind of see where we are 2 or 3 steps down the line?
Our feeling on it is, the stuff that you guys are doing right now with the testing is great. Anything you can do to get the material out in the ocean is the best way to go by really fine-tuning what those numbers are. What we found, and it really is no different than what we ended up doing in Port Hueneme, we started a parallel path. We started the designing and the engineering, assuming the worst case. You can always go and you permit it to the agencies and you tell them you need this big of a hole, and on the side you're testing and trying to minimize the amount of material that's going to go there. Nobody's going to complain if you come back and you say the hole needs to be half that size because you just lessen the air impacts. As long as you go and you assume worst case, it's always easier to make it smaller. Now, if you go back and you permit it this big and you go back and say, sorry, it's got to be twice that big, then you're going to have issues. So we think, our proposal is, you definitely look at it on a parallel path. Start big. You can pull it in smaller down the road. It's easy from that standpoint. Everything's scalable.
So a question, roughly then, how long, let's assume you get to the point where you've completed the design and you've got your permits, you're ready to begin. So how long does it take to dig the hole And then how long after that will it take to dredge and fill the hole and cover it back up, roughly?
There's a couple of different questions there. On digging the hole, it depends on probably where you put the hole and what type of equipment you go with. There's kind of two philosophies. You can go in and have bigger equipment, probably more impactful to people, more disruption in the harbor, but you get it done faster. Or do you go with smaller equipment that's not as disruptive and you let it stretch out? I can tell you Port Hueneme was one end of the extreme. We went with the biggest equipment possible, wanted to get it dug as fast as possible. We excavated almost 600,000 meters in like 22 days. That was a big dredge, big pipe. I wouldn't see you guys doing something like that here, but on the other side, if you went in with a very small little, something like you guys are doing in Upper Newport Bay, something like that could take you, 6 or 8 months to dig the hole.
Was that around the clock or just?
That was around the clock dredging. Yeah.
And
then filling the hole, it's kind of the same thing. Filling the hole is a lot slower than digging the hole. Ideally, digging the hole, you would put a hydraulic dredge in and you literally just suck the material out, pump it where you want it to go on the beach. Putting the material in there is much more intensive because you're digging it out one bucket at a time, usually putting it into a barge, bringing that barge over, opening up, and dropping it down in the hole. There's other ways, to do it, but that's the most common.
Well, so the size of a hole that we would need is about comparable then to Port Hueneme?
Probably in volume, you'd be looking at a similar type hole. Port Hueneme is a little bit, you'd probably be looking something that's maybe like longer, like the shape of a football field, but not as deep. Port Hueneme, because they were constrained inside the harbor, is a smaller hole, but really deep.
So somewhere between 1 and 7 months to dig the hole, and then a year or two to do the dredging and fill it up and cap it?
It could be, depending on the phasing, yeah. Port Hueneme, from start to finish, it's a little bit smaller volume than what you guys are looking at. That project, start to finish, from the time they start excavating the hole to being out of there, is going to be about 6 months for that one, using bigger equipment. A lot of it just depends on the phasing, if you choose to do it all as once, or do you dig the hole and maybe dredge part this year, fill up some of the pit, maybe dredge a little bit more a few months later. Keep in mind the impacts are going to be moving around the harbor, so you look at working over in the West Lido area. If you had a hole over in the West Lido area there and you're doing digging over there for 3 or 4 months, 80% of the harbor will never know that anything's going on, because it'd be sort of isolated off in the corner. So, but yeah, it's definitely it's not a quick process.
Just out of curiosity, how do you keep the contaminants from? Once the barge drops the stuff into the water again, doesn't it now become in suspension and it spreads out to other areas, or?
Well, the geometry is such that, like especially in this case, you're talking about fairly shallow water and a deep hole. When they cut it open, they drop it. Most of the stuff falls down as a kind of a pile. Very little of it is going to come up and resuspend and go away. But what you can also do is you can put silk curtains around the hole. So where the barge goes in, drops the material, leaves, they close the curtain behind it, so you essentially close the hole in, so any material that comes up will settle back down in the hole. But it's just a factor of the currents, how deep the material's dropping. Typically, you try it out a few times and see how it works and behaves, and then you sort of adjust it. Like at Port Hueneme, for example, we're not having any problems at all. None of the material's coming back up out of the hole. So it's just the type of material, that's how it's working.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to wrap it up here. Tonight's council request. The second, to recap, our first part of this process was to develop the feasibility study, which everyone has on their desks right now. The second step is to do some geotechnical exploratory work, which is important because that tells us what type of material we are dealing with down in the harbor floor, if it's sand or if we're going to hit rock. We're pretty certain we're not going to hit rock, and we're fairly certain it's going to be nice sand. But we have to do this preliminary study before we can make a decision to proceed any further and make the big decision later on. So they're just going to dig down to minus 60, not dig down, but core down to minus 60 and in about 3 holes. And they can do that within a couple weeks here, analyze it, and be done with that by, by the end of May. Just to give you an idea, the question was asked where the CAD site would be in relationship. We're proposing it to be around in this general area. We can fine-tune that, of course. This area right here is where about 200 moorings are. This is generally open water. There are some, about 20 moorings right in this area. So we'll impact some moorings, but certainly a very small percentage. This right here is an alternate CAD site that we're going to go and do a core sample there as well, just because if these don't happen and we're out there the same day, let's put the guys to work, and we'll do an alternate site in case something bad happens. It's good to have a backup plan.
Chris, the primary site appears to be in one of the places that's a primary source for material that would otherwise be placed in the CAD. Are we going to sort of bring it up and put it right back down, or how does that work?
It'll be constructed in a way where those are some details that we'll have to work out as far as the mechanics of how the CAD site is actually built. We'll look forward to a report a little bit later on. But maybe there'll be two holes, like an interim hole. You build a small hole, and then you put the top layer of the big area into that hole, and you kind of juggle the material around so that you least impact, or you're not handling the equipment more than once if you can, and you're trying to find a home for all the sediments. So those are that's a good question, but we don't have all the details worked out.
Can't just put a cap on it and call it done?
I know. And this is my last slide here, and what this does, and I don't expect for anybody to be able to read this, however, it is in the fold-out section in your pamphlets, books there. And what this circle represents, this is kind of a decision tree, and this represents where we're at right now. We've done our concept plan that is on your desk, and we're asking the council to consider the proposal for the geotech work. That'll take us to right here. This line right here is a time frame. This says June of 09, July, September of 09. This says August of 010. And what this section does right here is I'll probably be coming back to the council in June or July, or maybe a little bit before, to really get the go-ahead from council. If we finally choose to go with this confined aquatic disposal site, we'll need to go and start our CEQA process, which follows this line right here. And we're probably going to be doing an EIR. I can only imagine that that's the steps that we'll be taking. But at the same time, while we're doing an EIR, on this right side, the engineering phase has to begin. It's going to take a while to engineer this and do all the details. So we see two parallel paths, so that come September of 2010, we'll be shovel-ready to build the CAD, assuming everything goes along as planned.
Chris, when we had the meeting with the Corps, I don't know if it was the gentleman that just got up and spoke or who, but somebody mentioned that that they thought this would be done on a mitigated negative deck and would get through the permitting agencies in 6 months, and it looks like you've completely changed that philosophy there.
We haven't changed.
Something happened?
No, nothing's happened. I'm just being overly prudent. We haven't decided if we'll do an MND or if we'll do an EIR. I've asked our planning department and planning director to help guide us through this process so that we can figure out the best alternative. But EIR is certainly a worst-case scenario, and I think it's better to plan for that. I think there is an impact. How much of an impact is to be determined, and I think we need to think about that some more. So I don't want to hang my hat on an MND just yet.
But Chris, it looks like even if we do an MMD, the time frame is about the same because it runs about to where you would get finished with your design.
That is correct. As I understand it, the EIR might add perhaps 2 or 3 more months onto the process. It's still going to be a long process. Those details need to be worked out, but we're weighing both options.
Okay. And then when are we going to talk about the money cost to this? I know that the Corps seemed to be pretty insistent, or I don't know if insistence is the word, certainly expecting anyway that there would be a certain contribution coming from the city. In fact, the Colonel was trying to get out of us a dollar amount as far as how much we're going to commit to this project. And there's a total cost that might be coming from all these different agencies, and then how much the city's going to contribute. When are we going to start talking about all of that?
Mr. Mayor, it's my intention at the second study session for the budget review that we would have that item as a discussion item.
So when you look at Chris's decision tree, we'll be talking about money early enough along so that we'll be making those decisions with the dollar cost in mind and exactly how we're going to be coming up with, I mean, it seems to me that pretty clear that they're expecting that we pay part of this in one form or another here.
Yes, that would be my intention.
If I can sort of, now that my memory sort of jarred a little bit from that meeting, I think that the discussion of joint planning was connected to an MOU between the Corps and the city. And then within that MOU, we would start to define the costs and who would pay what.
Yes, the MOU would define what the city would pay for. The city has already jump-started the project by starting the testing and developing this concept plan. We're further jump-starting it this evening, hopefully with approval for these core samples. The big decisions are going to be made come summertime in June. And if the city can contribute to going down and designing the engineering and doing the environmental work, and possibly, well, the colonel said, if you build us a CAD site, we will come and dredge your harbor, assuming funding, with that caveat. So it seems to me that the city would need to seriously consider design, environmental, and construction of the CAD site.
Okay, as I remember, the colonel made the overture to the city to participate in this joint planning, and that there would be an MOU element. So that's why, or what I'm thinking is, we need to follow up with that and have the colonel come back with Bay issues and start a dialogue on the joint planning on the MOU, which will define the costs.
I think that's a good idea. And I think the colonel would also be waiting to see how the funding comes about, too. Whether they get the funding for the lower bay in the 10 budget or the 11 budget. So there are some factors, but that's certainly something to look into.
Well, he seemed to be awfully insistent that for this to move ahead, that we had to have some amount of money in the 2010 budget. Now, I don't know if it was $1 million or two or what, but there had to be something in the federal budget. And then once that money was in, then he seemed to indicate there would be some flexibility in keeping this going as an ongoing project. But if I understood him correctly, though, it seemed to be that it was very critical that we had something in the 2010 federal budget.
And you are exactly correct. Once we have money dedicated to a project, then it's easier to continue to fund that project. And we're working with the Corps, both locally and in D.C., on doing our best with our legislators to try and get a line item in on next year's budget.
I think May 20th is a date. I mean, these funding dates can slip, but it's my understanding that on May 20th, they will know if there's seed money.
Okay. So that's what I'll be asking the council this evening, and if you've certainly asked a lot of questions, if you have any more, I'd be happy to answer the best that I can.
Okay, any other questions for Chris? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, does anyone from the public want to comment on this item? Okay, seeing no one, we'll go on to public comments on non-agenda items. Any public comments on non-agenda items? Okay, seeing none there, we'll adjourn to closed session.